The Neolithic in Africa centers around this belt across sub-Saharan Africa, and includes the study of what's going on in in the Nile River Valley with the development of Egyptian civilization. And so there's considerable complexity in southern Egypt's Neolithic economy and social system that's been revealed in excavations. So we know that Nabta Playa was occupied for the first time kind of on the long term around 12,000 years before present. We talked about how cattle were there pretty early, really around between about 9 and 11,000 years before present. So we've got this early evidence of dabbling, I guess, in domestication of cattle and relying on the animal products that you're able to get from cattle. By 9,000 years before present, Nabta Playa was inhabited year round. So we've got the development of sedentary villages. Before that, it was used kind of seasonally. This time period, around 7,500 years before present, there had been a period of major drought that had driven people away from Nabta Playa. And at this point, new settlers move in and bring with them more complex, let's say, markers of civilization. And so prior to abandoning Nabta Playa, we had one group of people present. After this drought, when it was resettled by individuals that arguably had full-fledged kind of state systems, including more sophisticated social and ceremonial systems. The evidence suggests that the Neolithic spread to Europe roughly 8,000 years ago when we've got farmers and herders from the Middle East moving into Europe. So about 8,500 years ago, we've got communities in the Mediterranean area, Greece, Italy, etc., that start to spread crops across Europe. By 6,000 years before present, we've got thousands of farming villages all the way from Russia to northern France. And so in a period of roughly 2,000, 2,500 years, we see a transition from these foraging groups that had been kind of holdouts in Europe to full-fledged farming economies, and then the expansion of state-level socio-political systems. So domestication in these Neolithic economies spread really rapidly across Europe and Asia. One of the reasons why is, and we'll talk about this towards the end of the lecture, that the bulk of the landmass in Europe and Asia is arranged east to west. And so what this means is that you're holding things kind of at a constant latitude. So you only have to innovate something once. You only have to domesticate a crop once, and then it can spread rapidly. If you stay at the same latitude, you're talking about the same growing season. You're talking about the same day length cycles. You're talking about oftentimes the same level of rainfall, etc. So there's not as much, let's say, fiddling that has to happen in order to be able to move things across latitudes. I mean, when you move things to a different latitude, then you've got to take into account different climatic kinds of characteristics. In Asia, by 8,000 years before present, we've got domesticated sheep, goats, cattle, wheat, and barley in Pakistan. Now, Pakistan, the Indus River Valley, is one area that did not independently invent agriculture. So there may be a question on the exam that talks about, with respect to the origins of agriculture, which of the following does not belong? The answer will be the Indus River Valley, precisely because we see early civilization in the Indus River Valley. We've got the Harappan civilization, for example, but this is not an area where agriculture was innovated. Instead, this is an area where once agriculture was innovated, it rapidly spread there from the Middle East and state-level political systems arose. It's not a site of independent invention. China was also one of the world's first areas to develop farming and had two different kinds of crops that were brought to the forefront. In northern China, you've got millet being one of the first domesticated crops. There was also reliance on wheat in northern China around 10,000 years before present. In southern China, we see the domestication of rice. And we still have this divide. I mean, in northern areas of China, it's too cold to grow rice. It's also in many areas too dry to grow rice because rice has this period of its life cycle where it has to be submerged. China saw, goats and cattle and sheep as well, but also a few different domesticated animals. This picture here shows a water buffalo. When you think about southern China and rice farming in particular, water buffalo have evolved in tandem with rice farming. And one of the reasons why is that water buffalo are well suited to stand for long periods of time in submerged sites. You know, they evolved to be able to kind of be in these murky, swampy, marshy sorts of areas. And so they don't, for example, get hoof rot and other things that can happen to other species of livestock when they stand in water for too long. And so these water buffalo are used to do things like trample the fields, to pull plows through, etc., and are uniquely adapted for this kind of swidden rice paddy type of agriculture. We've got some significant contrast between the process of domestication in the old world and that in the new world. Firstly, we've got a different reliance on livestock. We are not able to get the same reliance or kind of proliferation of domesticated livestock in the new world that we did in the old world. Now, we've got to remember as we talk about um, animal evolution in the old world. I mean, animals had at least 1.9 million years where they were actively hunted by early hominins and then, you know, Homo sapiens, where they've developed a suite of behaviors and traits that help them to evade being hunted. And so many of these species that we domesticated, we had hunted prior to that point. And so animals that are hunted evolve kinds of vigilance behavior, evasive maneuvers, etc., to help them get away from predation, and that means that a larger proportion of the population is staying alive. I mean, it doesn't mean we're not successful in the hunt, but we tend not to hunt those species to extinction. When we came across to the New World as a species, we encountered animals that had never before been predated upon. You know, we're talking about things like, obviously, mammoths and mastodons, but this bison antiquus that we hunted to extinction. These animals didn't know to be afraid of humans. These animals hadn't evolved any sorts of behaviors that would help them to be able to survive. Really large brained, really smart, really kind of tool reliant hunters. So we did as humans are wont to do, and we over harvested them. We drove bison antiquus to extinction. We drove the giant ground sloth to extinction, etc. So what that did was removed kind of the option set that we had available to domesticate, and it left us with a few notable exceptions. So in the New World, we've domesticated things like llamas. Llamas are great for providing wool. Llamas are great for use as pack animals. In theory, you can ride a llama, but they're not great for riding long distances. They also tend to have a rather unpleasant disposition, and you know they're not big milk producers, though you can, of course, being mammals, get milk out of llamas. So we don't have something that's as kind of prolific a producer as cattle are. Some of the other animals that we domesticated included turkeys, which turkeys are great and all that, but you know we can't have the same kind of complex economy relying on animal products from birds that we can on mammals. Mammals, we don't just have to kill them and eat them. We're able to harvest milk from them and build kind of a diet built off milk-based products like cheese and yogurt and such. We can collect eggs from domesticated livestock, but it's still not quite the same with the kind of degree or magnitude of production that we get from some of these grazing mammals. We also domesticated guinea pigs. And this is one of my favorite pieces of visual imagery, the idea of the cowboys riding off into the sunset surrounded by their flocks of guinea pigs. Or perhaps the imagery of the guinea pig dairy operation with these really, really, really small suctions, these really, really, really small pieces of tubing, trying to get even enough milk to drink a glass of through milking your guinea pigs. So we just don't have animals that are as kind of useful to domesticate or predisposed to high levels of production from domestication. The three caloric staples from the New World are maize or corn, which has certainly spread the world over, potatoes, which again spread very rapidly to the Old World once European colonialism kind of quote unquote discovered them. And there was just an interesting article uh, that I'd seen that talks about the Four Corners potatoes. You know, we have endemic potatoes to our regions of New Mexico, and these Four Corners potatoes are really high in protein and key vitamins, and only about the size of a dime. So, quite different from these kind of Idaho russet potatoes or what we might use for a baked potato. And then the third is manioc or cassava, which again, we'll see a picture in just a second that shows that it's this kind of root slash tuber crop that we're eating those storage organs. The other crops that we've domesticated include beans, squash, quinoa, goosefoot, marsh elder, and sunflower. None of these were prolific enough, though, to build up this carbohydrate staple, this carbohydrate base for ever increasing populations. So we had much lower population density in the New World as well, which led to kind of a slower emergence of full-fledged states. The Three Sisters that we know of here in New Mexico is the basis of the Mesoamerican diet. You've got corn, beans, and squash that are grown together. You plant the corn first so that the stalk can grow up and reach towards the sun. You then plant the beans around the corn. This gives the beans kind of a scaffolding to climb up. They're able to use the corn as kind of their poles that they climb, and then the beans also give a benefit to the corn. You're able to increase your corn output by growing them in a symbiotic relationship with legumes. Legumes have a symbiosis with microorganisms that in the waste products of the microorganisms, there's a high concentration of nitrogen, and nitrogen is one of the things with which we need to fertilize to produce higher output. So, by planting corn with beans, you're able to boost the output both of your corn and your beans. And then lastly, you plant the squash kind of around the base. The beans and the corn give it some shade, and it can spread extensively around the base of the plant. And so here we have an image that shows what manioc looks like when it's being harvested. We're not really eating the growth, the leaves, or the stems. What we're eating are these storage tubers, these roots. In the New World, food production was independently invented in three areas: Mesoamerica, including Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize, the eastern United States, and the south central Andes. In both the Andes and Mesoamerica, we've got a lag time of about 3 to 4,000 years from the time that agriculture was first innovated, or that we were, starting these farming economies, to the time that we see the emergence of full-fledged states. In southeastern United States, some would argue that we don't see the emergence of full-fledged states until Europeans come in this era of colonialism. So, that's ignoring some of the knowledge that we have of groups like the Cahokia, who arguably may have had characteristics of states even without some of the more visible markers like monumental architecture. New World farming began in the lowlands of South America. It spread to Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean islands. We've got squash seeds that we found in Peru that date back to 10,000 years. Interestingly, the first plants that were domesticated in the New World were not these carbohydrate staples. It wasn't these cereal grains. Instead, it was things that had another use. And so some of the earliest squash to be domesticated were a kind called bottle gourds. And so it was more the using the gourds for the vessels. That was the reason that we started intentionally planting them, more so than actually eating anything from those squash. Between 9,000 and 8,000 years before present, farmers were selecting certain characteristics in their cultivated plants. We innovated corn from a grass called teosinte, but during this time, even while we're selecting for particular traits, we still are engaging in broad spectrum foraging. By 7,000 years ago, plots had been expanded into nearby forests, cleared using slash and burn techniques. And so this would mark that transition from living as foragers to living as horticulturalists. Horticulturalists are small scale gardeners that practice slash and burn clearing of forests and let their fields periodically lie fallow and kind of return to native growth. Maize domestication took place in the lowlands of southwestern Mexico, and here we've got a picture of teosinte. You see the grass on the right. Teosinte originally only had maybe 5 or 6 kernels per plant, so it wasn't a prolific producer. We certainly included it in our suite of gathered resources, but we actually got more food from foraging for things like mesquite pods than we did from teosinte. Maize cultivation spread to the Mexican Gulf Coast by about 7,300 years before present, but we'll still have a period of roughly 3 to 4,000 years before we see the emergence of early states in Mexico. So before farming, I'm sorry, the Mexican Highlanders had practiced broad spectrum foraging, and small game were more important than big game. They would seasonally move between sites, while Hawkins would hunt and gather in the fall and winter. They'd come together in the late spring and summer to harvest seasonally available plants like these bottle gourds. And they would base much of their diet off of these gathered mesquite pods. By 4,000 years before present, roughly 3,000 years after we had started domesticating corn, we finally get a cultivar of maize that provides more food than mesquite pods. So it's not until 4,000 years ago that we've got the kind of changes bred into corn that would allow it to become a carbohydrate staple. By 3,500 years before present, we've got permanent villages that are established based on maize farming. So a bit of a different pattern or sequence of the emergence of sedentism and agriculture. We have things that we domesticated in the New World that we utilized even though we were still semi-nomadic or, kind of seasonally in villages, like these bottle gourds. Whereas in the Old World, we see sedentary foraging emerge well before plant and animal domestication ever do. There are several factors that are useful for helping to explain the Neolithic. And remember that the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, now we're not talking about fixed time periods. We're talking instead about marking it site by site, that it's not specifically 10,000 years ago that one began. Rather, it's when those characteristics and when the ecology lends itself to developing more farming, more cultivated species. Sedentism predisposes groups to developing plant and animal domestication because we've got to have a suite of both plants and animals that are available for foraging but also useful for domesticating. Those mastodons that we had at the end of the Upper Paleolithic, not so useful for domesticating. Too dangerous, too large-bodied, not able to kind of weather the ecological changes that are going on. We also need plant species that are self-pollinating. We're not going to domesticate initially things that need our help or need us to spread pollen granules. Instead, it's going to be this process, these very prolific cereal grains that were already growing in natural stands and pretty easy to propagate and pretty easy to spread. And so one feature related to that is that these plants can pollinate themselves. So even if you only have 1 or 2 plants, you can get a pretty big yield because of the fact that you don't have to cross-pollinate. The climate has to also support a high degree of species diversity. One of the things that it has to have is a small-bodied game. One of the things that it has to have are some of these wild cereal grains, because these are the kinds of plants that are prolific enough, but also we're able to be bred to give us a high enough kind of carbohydrate staple. As climate change happens and population growth occurs, the need to sustain life in marginal zones drives hunter gatherers to start cultivating. With knowledge of domesticates, we don't necessarily always see domestication. It's not automatic. I mean, foragers have extensive knowledge about the plants that they gather, about the plants that they utilize. In the eastern United States, we had the knowledge of the process of domestication, but we didn't have kind of ecologies that were prolific enough that we were able to sustain the large population growth that then leads to even more innovation with response to agriculture. Hunting and gathering was still necessary because the animals and plants that we had available that we did domesticate weren't productive enough that we were able to base our diet on them. And so that doesn't happen until corn comes into North America. And some would argue that full-fledged states don't arise until really the European groups come and colonize. Animal domestication in the old world was typically limited to hierarchical herds, so we aren't talking necessarily about the early emergence of fully pastoral populations, more so that a select few would own or have access to these herds and control the distribution of their goods. The geography all of the continents also helps to explain kind of the ease or spread of food production. And so I mentioned this a few slides ago, but in Europe and Asia, the bulk of the landmass is oriented in an east-west direction, which means that all you really had to do was domesticate a crop once and then it could rapidly spread because it stayed at the same latitude. This is not true in the New World and in Africa, where the bulk of the landmass is oriented north to south, and you've got climatic features and contrasts that prohibit the spread of plant and animal life. And so we can see this represented in an image here when we talk about how the land masses are organized. You see that Europe and Asia, the bulk of it goes from east to west, whereas in Africa and the New World, it's north to south. Particularly when we're talking about New World species, there's only really kind of one species of animal that comes or crosses from South America into North America. So it's not just domesticated crops or domesticated livestock, even with naturally occurring species that are endemic to the New World. There's only one, the armadillo, that crosses from South America all the way through Central America on into North America. So we've got some big kind of ecological obstacles, climatic sorts of obstacles that prevent this rapid diffusion of food production once it is innovated. In what's now the United States, this east-west spread of farming was slowed by the dry climates of Texas and the southern Great Plains. So areas like Texas, Oklahoma, etc., weren't weren't wet enough for us to be able to really engage in large scale farming. And so this is part of what kept Plains Indians able to practice kind of their mixed hunting and pastoral sorts of lifestyles, was the fact that we couldn't spread this technology. And even in the desert Southwest, when we talk about kind of prehistory into early history of the ancestral Puebloans, they were farming. They were relying on the Three Sisters and practicing what we would call arid horticulture, but they were also still hunting and gathering. So in the desert Southwest, at least, we're familiar with this idea that in certain kinds of climates, arid climates, etc., we're not going to get a very quick transition to full reliance on farming. We've got to also engage in our traditional subsistence practices. And then with food production comes a suite of costs and benefits. I mean, we can certainly point out some of these benefits, the innovation that comes with food production, not only because of having different kind of raw materials present, like having wool that can be spun and then woven, but also because for the first time in human evolution, we are able to free people up from the process of producing food. So we get what we call occupational specialization, where as long as you have enough people farming, you don't need to have everyone farm. And this is associated with the emergence of the state because we've got full time politicians as states emerge. We've got full time religious professionals as states emerge. And they're supported by this vast overproduction of the carbohydrate staple by those who are doing the farming. So this frees people up to dabble in different endeavors. And so we've got spinning and weaving, we've got pottery. Why don't we use pottery when we're nomadic hunter gatherers? Well, pots are fragile, they're also really heavy. We're going to use basketry and things instead. So um, pottery is useful because dirt is relatively ubiquitous. You can often find clays that are present just in your natural landscape that you can sustainably produce large quantities of things. And so, with pottery also comes brick making, as we're getting knowledge of how to work with the dirt and how firing may make things more stable, etc. We get sophisticated art and architecture styles that come with masonry work. We start to build arches, for example. We dabble in smelting and casting metals. We start to innovate metallurgy. One of the reasons that metallurgy emerged, and one of the places where it emerged, was in this area of Mesopotamia. We talked about the high plateau that was above 5,000 feet. Well, this area had natural copper deposits. And so, just kind of in playing around with raw materials, ancient Mesopotamians found that if you hammered copper, it made it malleable. If you hammered it too much, it made it brittle and it cracked, but then you could heat it and get it to be malleable again. And so we started with what we call the chalcolithic, or working with copper. We eventually then start adding either tin or bronze to the copper to produce, or tin or arsenic to the copper to produce bronze. It's only at later times when we've got the technology to have even hotter fires at forges that we're able to start smelting iron and get heavy duty tools. And we think of metallurgy and the use of metal for tools as innovation and as an advance. It doesn't mean that metal tools are necessarily sharper or sturdier than stone tools. In fact, in neurosurgery, there are obsidian blades that are still used. So obsidian blades have an advantage in that they can get even thinner and sharper than stainless steel can, but they also don't rust. And so, particularly if you're using them for surgery where they're going to frequently be exposed to bodily fluids and such, there's this benefit if they're able to not to rust. Now, what is the advantage over metal tools over stone tools? Well, if they get broken or chipped or dulled, all we have to do is reheat them, and we can use the same raw materials to produce a new metal tool. We get the emergence of trade and commerce. Trade starts because people migrate. And so, as people are moving into new areas, they still want resources that come from the area from whence they came. And so they set up these kind of large scale, long distance trade networks. And this spreads access to goods, it spreads access to technology, access to knowledge. And so it's part of what helped agriculture spread across the globe was a system of trade and commerce. It is also, again, one of these explanations for, or hypotheses for, things that led to state formation. By 5,500 years before present, Middle Easterners were living in vibrant cities. Particularly when we use adjectives like vibrant, we think of cities as being a good thing. Well, they are, and they can be, but they can also be death traps. And we'll talk about why in just a sec. The new economy also brought hardship. Food producers typically work harder than foragers, and they have a less adequate diet. Foragers will work on average 2 hours a day if they're female, 7 hours a day if they're male, but maybe only 3 to 4 days a week. So they've got a lot of free time. What can they do during that free time? Well, they can laugh, they can have sex, they can make music, they can hang out, they can smoke psychoactive substances. It really doesn't matter what they do. And their free time is not viewed as unproductive time. It's very important social time. Food producers, by contrast, have to work very long hours, 7 days a week. Now, it's not those people who are in positions of power that have to work these long hours. Rather, it's the commoners, the people whose labor is being exploited. When we talk about a less adequate diet, I mean, the agricultural diets are based predominantly on these cereal grains, and that's all well and good, and they provide calories, but they're not particularly rich in protein. You're missing out on some key vitamins like vitamin C and such. So your diet becomes, although adequate to stay alive and adequate to survive, becomes nutritionally lacking, leading to the development of some of these lifestyle disorders. Why is it that we see a high proportion of heart disease and diabetes among Native American populations? If they were practicing their traditional indigenous diet, we wouldn't, because their metabolism evolved for that particular diet. But it's when we put them on what we call the standard American or SAD diet, that's high in these cereal grains, refined sugars, etc., that their health starts to suffer. We get obesity, we get diabetes, we get heart disease, chronic inflammation, etc. So this less adequate diet can be detrimental to our health and even survival over the long run. We get herds, fields, and irrigation systems that need more care. So we've got more regulatory demands. We've got more maintenance demands. Among hunter-gatherer groups, the only thing that you might have to maintain are your tools, your weapons, your digging sticks, your bows and arrows, etc. You're not going to have to maintain a structure, keep animals alive. They're going to do that themselves because they're wild. We don't have to kind of monitor and mend irrigation systems. Food producers tend to have more children. We've talked about the why of that as well. This change in energy balance, the fact that we're not covering these same vast distances in our quest for food, the fact that we have the availability now of foods for weaning that are able to reduce the interbirth interval. The division of labor also grows more complex. We no longer have what we refer to as a sexual division of labor, where men and women are doing different things. Now we've got occupational specialization as well. And so we see people trained from very young ages for particular kinds of careers or work. And this will, as we transition into industrial and then post-industrial economies, this can translate into phenomenal levels of education and skill required to be able to pursue certain kinds of career fields. We get public health that declines in food producing societies. A lot of this happens because of the growth of urban areas. Now, for one, our diet is less varied. We're missing out on key critical macro and micronutrients, so we are more susceptible to pathogens because our immune system can't function as well because of the things in our diet that are lacking. We see the emergence of dental caries for the first time. That means cavities, because what we're eating gets metabolized into sugars, and that fuels bacteria in our mouths. We also have a problem because of disease communication. When we live in close contact, we're more likely to come in contact with pathogens. And by close contact, I mean that you're close enough people can sneeze on you, cough on you, etc. But we also have this critical problem of what to do with waste, both human waste and non-human waste. And one of the things that we had traditionally done was toss what we don't need into the river. Well, when you defecate into the river or toss decomposing plants and animals into the river, you end up introducing this kind of venue for pathogen proliferation. And so you don't want to, for example, drink the water that you poop in. And so often by using the river to get rid of things that you no longer wish to to have to deal with, it doesn't necessarily impact your health and safety. It impacts the health and safety of the populations that live downriver from you. And so there are areas of the world where it's still not safe to drink the water. You're not going to want to go and drink tap water in India, for example. India's got one of the most polluted rivers in the world with the Ganges. Um, when hunter gatherers are exposed to pathogens. Let's say they drink from a contaminated water source, and a lot of people get sick. They get up and they move. They're nomadic. It's not that big a deal. They don't have to relocate vast quantities of goods and people over long distances. So they move away from illness. There's a line in the documentary Nye Story of a Kung woman that said, when we were sick, we moved away from the sickness. Cities can't do that. People living in sedentary agricultural communities can't do that. Thinking about the Ganges, we know the Ganges is polluted. People that live near the Ganges know that it is polluted, but it's also a sacred river that has mythical healing properties in their culture. And so, even with the pollution along the Ganges, people still make pilgrimages to submerge their bodies in the Ganges to be able to appeal to the supernatural for healing. So, our knowledge of what contaminated water does to us doesn't always stop us from engaging and utilizing that contaminated water. It's hard to move cities. With cities, you've got problems of human waste. We don't have indoor plumbing and toilets and wastewater treatment facilities and such right away. So what are you supposed to do with excrement? Well, you often use the chamber pot overnight, and when you wake up in the morning, you dump it out the window, even though there may be people living in the alley down under the window from where you're dumping your chamber pot. We've also got this problem of dead bodies. And one of my favorite scenes from Monty Python's Holy Grail is where the guy's ringing the bell saying, "Bring out your dead," and there's a body on there that says, "I'm not quite dead yet." So it's not just waste that we produce, it's also this, dead bodies and such. How are we supposed to take care of them? We don't get a germ theory of disease until much, much later. We get a higher degree of social inequality and poverty as well. And so we drive this wedge between the haves and the have-nots, the bourgeois and the proletariat, whatever terminology you use for them. Social inequality leads to a lot of struggle. I mean, when you don't have access to food, you might engage in behaviors that are deemed socially not socially acceptable. You may engage in crime. You may engage in prostitution. You may engage in even just begging and panhandling. The rate at which we start to degrade our environments also increases dramatically. It's really with the Industrial Revolution that we enter into the Anthropocene, but we started this whole process with the advent of agriculture. We clear forests for plots of land. We don't generally let the forest then reclaim that land later. We continuously cultivate it. We have over use of natural resources. We've got contamination that we introduce into the environment. We drive species to extinction. All of these things arose really with the advent of agriculture. And so this slide then summarizes some of these costs and benefits. We get great things like discoveries and inventions, but on the flip side, we've got child labor, we've got less nutritious diets, we've got taxation, public health declines, etc. So we often think of the innovation of agriculture as this thing that's fantastic for us and leads to the emergence of quote unquote civilization, but we've got to recognize that a lot of things about human lives changed after the advent of agriculture, things that still negatively affect us today. When you think about these lifestyle diseases, high rates of stress, anxiety, depression, we're not well adapted, at least biologically, psychologically, for life in a fully modern context. And so our summary slide just kind of reiterates these points that are important from this lecture.